A lot in here, actually, so we're kind of taking it slow and looking at different ideas that Jesus is talking about. And today we're going to look at verses 12 through 19 specifically and talk about persecution. So that's our subject. We're going to talk about persecution today because I believe that Jesus thinks about being persecuted a little differently than we do, or at least than we naturally do. And that he has good reasons for thinking that way. And that we need to think about being persecuted the way that he does. That's going to be my point, basically. But I wonder, before we get into this text too deeply and talk about how Jesus thinks about persecution, how you right now think about being persecuted, about being hated so much by other people that they get angry at you and mock you and slander you and question you and harass you and hurt you and try to make your life more difficult because of your relationship with Jesus. Are you for it or against it? Just joking, obviously. I know almost it sounds like a silly question to even ask, really. How do we feel about being persecuted? We don't like it. If you've ever been hated, it's not super fun. I've got one person I know that pretty much hates me, I think, and I say anything to him, even remotely, about Jesus or the Bible, and he'll go off and he'll start shouting at me or writing these long letters or emails to me filled with all kinds of bad things that he's saying about me. And it's been a little while since we've interacted, actually. But I remember I used to get his letters, and even though I knew how he was going to treat me in that letter, like I knew what he would say before I read it, I would start reading anyway and be really, really hurt. So I finally had to stop reading them. I don't like being hated like that at all. Most of us don't. In fact, we don't really even like people being upset with us. But especially if they're upset with us and they're wrong. That's got to be the worst. When they're not even upset with us for a good reason, for something we could apologize for. And so what do? We try to avoid it, obviously. We try to avoid ever being misunderstood, ever giving people a reason that they could be against us. And sometimes we try to avoid that at all cost, honestly. Like we don't even put ourselves in a situation where we think there's a chance that people might get upset with us like that. And it can become a lifestyle, actually, avoiding that, like a habit or a way. So if we think somebody's not going to like what we're going to say, we don't say it. Or we do, and we try to be so careful that we don't say much of anything, really. We put so many caveats on it, like, this is just my opinion. This is how I feel. It's an option. Maybe you want to think about it. You don't have to, though. It's up to you. Either way, we work so hard at making sure we don't stand out. We don't ruffle feathers, and that nobody has reason to ever be bothered by us, that when people are, it feels strange to us. I mean, we don't like persecution, that's obvious, because the fact is we don't like people being upset with us. And so then we make a habit of staying away from anything that might get somebody angry with us. And then when it happens, it starts to feel really strange to us. Like, how could this happen? I think persecution feels really strange to us. Like, if somebody is upset with me like this, I must have done something wrong. Because if I'm saying the right thing and I'm doing the right thing, this should not be happening. And I know not everyone's exactly like this, of course, but for some people, I think a lot of us, the fact that someone is upset pretty much automatically means that you must have said something wrong. Or you must have done something wrong. And so I know it's kind of a weird question. How do you think about persecution? How do you feel about it? But it's an important question because it impacts how you respond to it. For example, if I think it's unusual, I'm going to be surprised when it happens. And if you think it's unusual, you're probably going to make changes to your life so that it doesn't happen. I think I've done this, honestly, because I know when I was younger, I didn't really have a category for people not liking me for doing what was right. Though, of course, theoretically, I understood that. But still, I thought in real life, I kind of thought if I just say the right things and do the right things, then most people will be happy with me. Which is not really how the Bible describes life in this world. Right now, that's the thing. That may be how I thought the world worked, but that's not how the Bible says the world works. Biblically, persecution is normal. It is not strange. It is normal. And I'm going to show you that from Luke 21 in a minute, that Jesus doesn't think persecution is surprising. But really, if you're reading your Bible at all, that's obvious pretty much from the start. Like, just go back to the beginning of the world as an example, all the way back to right after Adam and Eve sinned, because Genesis 3:15, what does God say? He says, I'll put enmity between you and the woman. And he's talking to Satan ultimately, and he's saying, I will put enmity between you and the woman and between your offspring and her offspring, which means that Satan is going to have followers. And that those followers are going to hate godly people. And then you turn to Genesis chapter 4, and what happens to the very first godly person we meet? Bang, his own brother kills him. So persecution has been going on a long time. In fact, if you fast forward to the end of the Old Testament, the writer of Chronicles summarizes Israel's history like this. And Israel was like the nation that was supposed to be God's nation. So kind of the people with the most revelation for sure, and kind of the best people on the planet. And he says, 2 Chronicles 36, verse 15, the Lord, the God of their fathers, sent persistently to them by his messengers because he had compassion on his people, on his dwelling place. But how did they respond? They kept mocking the messengers of God, despising his words, and scoffing at his prophets until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people until there was no remedy. And so godly people in the Old Testament never had it easy. And you flip to the New Testament and you see that did not change at all just because Jesus came into the world. In fact, you know what happens soon after Jesus is born? Matthew says the person in charge killed all the male children in the town where Jesus was born because he was trying to kill Jesus. And so Jesus, who is the ultimate godly person, is facing persecution from the start and even living for a refugee for a while because of how much he's hated. You read his life story, and he's lied about, he's slandered, he's called all kinds of nasty things. People take offense at him, they try to kill him, and eventually do in the worst way imaginable. And so obviously, people hating you for doing the right thing shouldn't be surprising. But what's funny as you read the Gospels is that the disciples seem to be having a hard time processing that. I mean, that's kind of the context for Luke 21. Part of why there is a Luke 21, this chapter that we're looking at, is because the disciples weren't expecting persecution. Which is why you find as Jesus talks about the future that they're not asking him questions like, oh my goodness, how are we going to handle the pain? Or what are we going to do when you die? But they're always talking to Jesus about, hey, which one of us is the greatest? And the reason they're talking like that is not because they're egotistical or something, or because they didn't know what the Bible said about the godly being persecuted, but because they were hoping that Jesus was coming to change all that. I mean, that's part of why they were so excited about Jesus. They were expecting him to judge the world, defeat evil, and establish God's kingdom on earth. And that expectation was really strong with them. to the point where we saw that even as Jesus is telling them about the temple being destroyed, they're not discouraged and thinking everything's over, but they're anticipating instead what's going to happen next. And they're saying, "Teacher, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when these things are about to take place?" Because they're thinking after Jesus judges the temple, he's going to restore the kingdom to Israel and set up his throne on earth in Jerusalem, and that everything's going to be amazing. Which is not something that they're making up either. This is not like crazy talk, because it's something that the Old Testament promises. There is definitely going to be a day when persecution is over and the godly win. The issue for Jesus is not whether or not it's going to happen. It's going to happen. The issue is timing. And that's what Luke 21 is about, timing. Because the end is coming. It's just not going to be as soon as the disciples expected. You remember verse 9, Luke 21, verse 9. Jesus says, "And when you hear of wars and tumults, do not be terrified, for these things must first take place, but the end will not be at once." And the fact that the end would not be at once had a lot of implications for what they should be expecting life to be like after Jesus dies. Jesus says it's going to be tough. You remember last week maybe? We see that he talks about false teaching, verse 8, and political uncertainty, verse 9, and persecution, verse 12. And that is the big one, I think, that Jesus focuses on. He talks about the end in verses 10 or 11, or at least the preview of the end. And then he says, but before all this, before the moment you're waiting for, where everything changes, what? Do you see? It says, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors for my name's sake. And then if you go down to verse 16, it gets worse. He says, you will be delivered up even by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and some of you they will put to death. You will be hated by all for my name's sake. And I want you to think about that right now. Like, really think about that. Are you thinking? What if that was your future? What if Jesus told you that your future was people hating you because you love him? What if Jesus told you that your future was being taken to prison and your freedom being taken away because of your relationship with him? What if Jesus told you that your future was having your own family betray you because you were a Christian? What if Jesus told you that your future was being killed because of him? Because, those are not really hypothetical questions, not totally. They're not as out there as we might feel. Though, yeah, as we look at Luke 21, we should know Jesus is talking to Jewish disciples here about what's going to happen to them specifically after he dies and before the temple is destroyed. And so there are some things that were going to be unusually intense for them as they were living in that particular moment, and some things that are different about what was going to happen to them than what's going to happen to us. And yet, while it's true that some of our circumstances are different, it's also true that people have not really changed that much fundamentally. They still hate Jesus. Which means that if you take a stand for Jesus, you usually are going to suffer for it. There's one thing Jesus makes clear here, it's that his death and resurrection did not change that. If anything, it intensified it. Persecution is not something strange. People being angry at you and upset at you for doing right is not something strange. It's normal, according to Jesus. And so I'm asking you right now to think about being persecuted. Like, what if being hated was normal for people who love Jesus? How would you process that? Because like I said, most of us, probably all instinctively have one answer. We don't like it. We want to shape our lives so it never happens to us. We want to avoid it. We want to do everything we can so that it never happens. We fear it. And I think we see Jesus' answer here is different than ours often is, because it's not freak out. It's not hate your life. It's not, oh my goodness, you must have done something wrong. It is opportunity, verse 13. This will be your opportunity. This is what it will be like, verse 12. And verse 13, this will be your opportunity to bear witness. Like, hey, look at this again, because there's an advantage for you here. Which obviously is a very, very different way of looking at the world if you slow down and think about it. Jesus has a different way of thinking about persecution. I mean, people are going to hate you. People are going to hurt you. People are going to shame you. People are going to gossip about you. People are going to take you to court because they want to kill you because of your relationship with me. And this will be what? The worst thing that ever happened to you. No. This will be your opportunity. This is part of how Jesus thinks about persecution, and I believe it's part of how you should think about it too. How you should think about being slandered, hated, attacked, and rejected because of your relationship with Jesus. I don't think we have to stop thinking it's painful. I don't think we have to stop thinking it's evil. I don't think we have to stop longing for things to change. But I do think it is something some of us need to make sure we stop spending so much energy trying to 100% avoid ever experiencing. That we stop fearing so much or viewing as something that's only terrible, only a disadvantage, for at least 3 reasons. And here's where I need to prove my case, because I know it's hard to think about doing something and people getting angry at you the way Jesus does. For some of you, honestly, you've been mentored, right, since you are a child, not to get people upset with you. and that's good. There's a part of that that's good. But that can be so deeply ingrained in you that it becomes like a habit, just a whole way of looking at life, that even when you're doing what's right, even when it comes to doing what's right, you feel like it's wrong. And so Jesus is telling us we need to think different about being persecuted for his sake. Like, we need to make sure we're really being persecuted for his sake, but if it's doing something right for his sake, we need to think about it differently. Because Jesus has reasons for thinking the way he does. This is not like for no reason. He has good reasons for thinking the way he does. And the first reason is that God is sovereign, and he uses people's anger at you and unfair treatment of you and acts of hostility towards you to give you an opportunity to bear witness. And bear witness means testify about the gospel, which is pretty much the most important thing that any of us can ever do in our lives. Like, this is why we're here. There are obviously a lot of important things we do, but if we made a list of important things, having opportunities to glorify God by telling people about who Jesus is and what he's done would have to be near the top. And one of the primary ways God gives us opportunities to do that right now is through people hating us and attacking us and trying to hurt us. So persecution is painful, yes, but persecution is purposeful too. God uses persecution. In fact, missions moment, if you look at a list of countries where people say the church is growing the fastest, what will you repeatedly find? You'll find countries like Iran, Afghanistan, Gambia, Cambodia, Algeria, and Somalia, which, of course, are places where there's so much persecution, and being a Christian is so costly. For example, in Iran, they banned the Bible, they closed church buildings, they censored Christian websites, they killed pastors, they imprisoned Christians. And yet I remember reading an article a while ago, this was before the war, but you know the title, The Story of the Church of Iran in 2 sentences. That was the title, and here are the 2 sentences. Persecution threatened to wipe out Iran's tiny church, sentence number 1. Instead, the church in Iran has become the fastest growing in the world and is influencing the region for Christ, sentence number 2. And that's shocking, but not shocking. You know what I'm saying? Because that's how the Bible says it normally works. Like, take this verse here where Jesus tells the disciples, these people dragging you to synagogues and courts is your opportunity. Because you keep reading the Bible, and it happened in the early church. I mean, Acts 8, verse 3 says, Saul was ravaging the church and entering house after house, dragging, that's the same word, dragging off men and women and committing them to prison, which seems terrible. But what happened? Verse 4, now those who were scattered went about preaching the word. In fact, if you want one man's life example of how this works, think about the Apostle Paul, because first, God used him to spread the gospel by persecuting the church, and then God used him to spread the gospel by being persecuted. It's amazing. It's like God has a habit, if you think about the way the Bible works, of taking the moment in the story that you think is the absolute end and using that moment as the key to accomplishing his purpose. So Joseph, he's sold into slavery by his own brothers and becomes the means of saving Israel. Or Pharaoh is trying to kill all of Israel's sons and creates the opportunity for Moses to be used by God to rescue them. Or Daniel is thrown into the lion's den, and he ends up causing this pagan king to make a decree basically commanding everyone in his kingdom to tremble and fear before God. And the early church, with Stephen being killed, Christians being thrown into prison, and it causes them to do what God was calling them to do, which is spread the gospel from Judea to Samaria to the ends of the earth. And so listen, how do you feel about persecution? We don't like persecution. And that makes sense. That's not totally wrong. Nobody's asking you to start liking something that's evil. The Bible nowhere tells us you're supposed to like the physical pain of being persecuted. And it definitely doesn't tell us we have to seek persecution. And it never tells us if where you're living, it's dangerous to be a Christian, you're not allowed to move. After all, even in Acts, people moved because of persecution. And Jesus tells his followers, when they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. And Paul, who was like the most courageous Christian ever, often moved from one town to the next after persecution. And so we talk about persecution, and there's no need for you to go out and try to be persecuted. You're not more godly because you try to make people hate you. You don't have to find persecution somehow. You just take a stand for Jesus, and it's probably going to happen. And when it happens, what do? That's the question. Do you freak out like this is the worst thing ever? Do you point the finger at God and be like, why aren't you working? Because he is working. And that's why Jesus' attitude is different. And I don't know, I guess I just think that's so encouraging because, as we look at the future, what are some of the absolute worst things that you could imagine happening to you? Because I think somebody coming into your home and physically grabbing you and taking you to prison just for loving Jesus might be one. Or being publicly humiliated before all your family and friends, or being betrayed by your mom, or being put to death, or being hated. Those would all be bad. And you know what Jesus tells the disciples? They're going to happen. That's going to happen. That's the way it's going to be. But they don't need to get super discouraged or scared because somehow in God's plan, what's amazing is that all those things are going to work together to accomplish what they want most, which means that we don't have to be so worried about the future and what's going to happen if we do the right thing. Because, man, even if they do their worst, we know God is using their worst to accomplish exactly what we want him to accomplish. It's going to give you an opportunity to bear witness. I remember reading a great quote from a missionary named Samuel Zwemer, and he was a missionary in an Islamic country, but he writes, when you read in reports of troubles and opposition, of burning up books, imprisoning Christians who are trying to distribute books, and expelling workers, you must not think that the gospel is being defeated. It is conquering. What we see under such circumstances is only the dust in the wake of the farmer who's plowing. God is turning the world upside down that it may be right side up. He that plows should plow in hope. We may not be able to see a harvest yet in this country, but furrow after furrow, the soil's getting ready for the seed. A few years ago, I watched a movie, kind of like a movie, called The Fool, the true Banana Man story. And you can watch it online for free. It's about this evangelist named Ray Comfort. And basically, it's about how he took a stand for Christ, and he used this illustration when he did, where he was trying to share the gospel, and he uses a banana. And one of he's a funny guy if you ever know Ray Comfort, but one of the most famous atheists in the world saw it, and he started mocking him in these big speeches that he would give, and it hurt him at first, Ray Comfort said. It was embarrassing to see all these articles on the internet about how big an idiot he was. But the whole point of the movie was to show how God used that shame to give him unbelievable opportunities for proclaiming the gospel. The times that you think God can't do anything, so often are the times when God is doing his greatest thing, which should be encouraging, obviously. And the reason to think about people hating you and slandering you and getting upset at you for you doing the right thing differently, a real reason. But all too often it doesn't. It doesn't make much of an impact on what we actually do. Like, we know God could use that, but we're still not willing to do it. And I think that's because when it comes to persecution, we're not always as worried about whether God is able to use it for good. We're more worried about us. I know that's where a lot of my fears come in. And even looking at these disciples, honestly, because, sure, persecution is going to give them an opportunity to bear witness, but what are they going to do with it if you're standing with Jesus that day? Because they don't have this amazing track record or something, which is why Jesus not only reminds them that God is sovereign, but he also makes some very specific promises, which is a second reason to think about persecution differently. You step out and obey Jesus, he's not going to leave you on your own. If you look at verse 14, Jesus promises to give the disciples the ability to speak in absolutely impossible situations. He says, but before all this, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors for my name's sake. This will be your opportunity to bear witness. Settle it, therefore, in your minds, not to meditate beforehand how to answer. For I will give you a mouth of wisdom, which none of your adversaries will be able to withstand or contradict. Which I don't know about you, but I've always thought was a pretty weird command, honestly. Like, you're going to be persecuted, and God's going to use this persecution to give you an opportunity to bear witness. So make a commitment, like this is really important, not to think about how you're going to answer. Because it's like, why not? Why not? Why couldn't they prepare? Because it's not like God normally has a problem with preparation. I spent a lot of time this week preparing to say something today. But I think Jesus is trying to address a pretty unique situation here, because think about being a Galilean fisherman who's been following Jesus for a couple years. And suddenly he's gone, and you are being dragged in front of like kings and governors. And you are on trial for your life. Because what's going to be your temptation? If you've got any humility, you're going to be thinking, I am not ready for this. Like, drag me in before the President of the United States today. I'm going to be feeling a little intimidated. Imagine I was a Galilean fisherman standing before one of Caesar's officials. And so Jesus is making them a promise. When you're put in this situation that, you feel is way too big for a guy like you, you don't have to worry about how you're going to come up with something amazing to say. All you need to do is trust me, because I'm going to give you a mouth of wisdom, which is an unusual way of talking. Like, when you read the Bible, you should notice funny ways of saying things. Mouth of wisdom. Why would he put it like that? But I think he puts it like that because of the Old Testament, actually. Because think about Moses back in Exodus. Because you remember how God calls Moses to go and rescue his people, and Moses tries to find every way out. And finally, he's like, God, I can't do this because I'm slow of speech and tongue. And God says what? He says, who has made man's mouth? Now, therefore, go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what to speak. And it wasn't just Moses either. If you think later in the book of Jeremiah, God calls Jeremiah, and he's like, I've appointed you as a prophet. And Jeremiah says, God, I don't even know how to speak. And God says, don't be afraid, because I'm going to be with you. And then God puts out his hand and touches his mouth and says, behold, I put my words in your mouth. And now Jesus is talking to his disciples here, and it's like those scenes are playing in the background where someone's being called to do something that seems impossible for God and looking for excuses, Moses, Jeremiah, the disciples, and he's reminding them when God calls someone to do something bigger than they think they can handle, he's committed to giving them the resources to do what seems impossible. You hear me now? Because we're so quick to say things are impossible, and it feels humble. But sometimes it's not. It's not humble. We got to trust. We can't do it. Yeah, but God can. I mean, think about these disciples, because here they are, mostly just a bunch of uneducated Jewish fishermen, and most of them, we hardly know anything about them even. And what we do know from the Gospels is not that good. They're not like understanding what Jesus is saying most of the time. They're asking all the wrong questions, and when Jesus dies, they're like running for their lives, denying him to like little girls. So it's not like these are naturally courageous men, and they're not naturally intellectual men or naturally persuasive men, even when Jesus was with them. So you would expect when he left everything to get worse, because now they're on their own, and they're going to have to go around and talk about the Messiah who was crucified, which is the exact opposite of what everyone was expecting the Messiah to do, and they were going to be persecuted and hated for doing it. You wouldn't think these men would be able to convince anyone. But here we are, 2,000 years later, and God used them to turn the world upside down. Do you understand all the problems they could have told Jesus as to why this was not going to work? Like us 11, Jesus plus Paul and Matthias, like this is the plan? Like, I'm not sure. We've thought through all the details. But God used them to turn the world upside down. And how did that happen? Jesus kept his promise. So what are you afraid of, Because what's the worst that can happen to you if you commit to taking a stand for Jesus? People get upset. People hate you. People slander you. Yeah, I know, that seems pretty bad. But how bad is it really? Because we look back and see God's used persecution over and over to advance the gospel. And it's not because those people back then were so different than you are. It's because Jesus kept his promise. Just look at the book of Acts, Acts 4. Peter and John, they're arrested just a little while after Jesus died. And they're put in custody. And on the next day, they're brought before the high priest, and they have to make a defense. And you know what happens when they finish? Acts 4:13. Now, when they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were uneducated common men, they were astonished. And they recognized that they had been with Jesus. Later, Stephen, in Acts 6, there are some people who get angry at him for standing with Jesus, and they argue with him. But Acts 6:19, they could not withstand the wisdom and the spirit with which he was speaking, which is exactly what Jesus said would happen. And we need to trust him. I think that's what the command in verse 14, not to meditate beforehand how to answer, is really about, because that's often confused me, because I've wondered, is Jesus saying it's wrong for me to prepare what I'm going to say before I take a stand for him? But the more I thought about it, the more I think that's probably missing what Jesus is getting at, because even later in the Bible, one of his disciples, Peter, when he's talking to people who are suffering persecution, says in 1 Peter 3:15, if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you'll be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense. And I don't think he's contradicting Jesus by saying we should always be prepared to make a defense. It's more likely it's an explanation, because I don't think Jesus has a problem with you praying if you're being persecuted, or asking for help, or considering the best ways you can honor him in how you respond. But instead, I think what Jesus is concerned about is us getting so anxious and trying to figure out how to defend ourselves and feeling like we're not going to be able to, that we don't trust him enough to actually make a stand. Because the truth is, fear has kept so many people throughout the years from really living for Jesus. It's kept me sometimes from living for Jesus. Like, I don't know what I would do in that situation. Well, I don't know what I would say. So I don't do it. I don't say it. And you think about real life and what often happens when you take a stand, and you kind of understand why people are afraid. Like, it kind of makes sense until you step back and think about why Jesus thinks about persecution so differently. And it's because, first, God's sovereign, and second, he's going to be with us, and third, because he knows true Christians are going to win. They're going to persevere, verse 18 and 19. These two verses are some really big promises about persevering, and we need them, because I don't know if you've read about some of what's happened to persecuted believers over the years, but it's intense. Like, take Polycarp as an example. So he was a Christian who was born in 69 AD or so, and he was arrested when he was 86 years old for being a Christian. And here's one description of his trial. The judge or the governor was trying to get him to recant, and he's like, hey, I'm going to modernize it, but he's like, I'm sure he didn't say hey, but he's like, have some respect for the dignity of your age. So you're old, man. You're old. Just swear on the divine spirit of Caesar. Change your mind about what you believe. Say, get rid of the atheists, Christians. They used to call Christians atheists because they only believed in one God. And the governor kept pressing him. He said, just swear the oath and I'll let you go. Curse the name of Christ. But Polycarp answered, for 86 years I've been his servant, and he's done me no wrong. How could I now blaspheme my king who saved me? I have wild beasts, said the governor, and I'm going to throw you to them unless you change your mind. Polycarp, bring them on. We Christians can't change from something better to something worse. The governor, since you don't think much of beasts, I'll have you roasted by fire unless you change your mind. Polycarp, the fire you're talking about burns for a very short time and then is quickly put out. Clearly, you're unaware of the fire of imminent judgment and eternal punishment that awaits the ungodly. So what are you waiting for? Come on, do whatever you wish. And so they took him, and they were actually going to nail him to the stake so that he wouldn't run as they were trying to burn him to death. But he told them, no, they could leave him. They didn't need to nail him, because the God who would give him the strength to endure the fire would give him the strength to stay there and be burned to death without the nails having to hold him. And God did. Or there was a woman named Perpetua, and she lived in the late hundreds and early 200s, and almost immediately after she became a Christian, she was arrested and taken to prison. And her father came to her while she was in prison, and this was her dad, and he's begging her to give up the faith. And so she said to her father, Father, do you see this vase here? Could it be called by any other name than what it is? And he said, no. And she said, well, neither can I be called anything other than what I am, which is a Christian. Later, the father came and he begged her. He's like, have pity on me. Have pity on my gray hair. Remember your mother and your brothers. And yet she wouldn't compromise. The day she was being taken to stand before the governor, as the governor turned to question her, her father burst into the courtroom with her baby, her child, and he grabbed her and he said, deny the faith. If only you'll have pity on your baby. And she said, I will not. And the governor said, are you a Christian then? She said, yes, I am. And her father cried out again, but the governor had heard enough, and he had his soldiers beat the father in front of her until he was silent. And then he condemned Perpetua to die, and they took Perpetua and the other believers into the arena where the animals and the gladiators were waiting, and a wild bull charged her, tossed her into the air, and onto her back. And she got up, and she went to help someone else who had been attacked. And then they let a leopard loose, and that leopard started attacking some of the Christians. And yet even that was taking too long for the crowd. So they called out for the soldiers, and the soldiers came, and they killed Perpetua and the other believers with the sword. And we could go on and on. I read about Ignatius, who was a pastor in the early church, and he wrote a letter to his church as the soldiers delivered him to Rome to face the beast in the Colosseum. And listen to what he says. He writes, "May nothing at all, whether of this world or the invisible world above, fight against me and prevent me from reaching Jesus Christ. Bring on the fire, the cross, the hordes of wild beasts. Let the cutting and directions begin, the wrenching of my bones, the dicing of my limbs, the grinding of my entire body, the hideous torture of the devil. Let all this befall me. Only let me attain Jesus Christ. Nothing from one end of the earth to the other matters to me anymore. The kingdoms of this age are meaningless. I would rather die for Jesus Christ than rule the entire world right now. He alone is the one I seek, the one who died for us. He's my desire, the one who rose again for our sake." And you read these stories and you're like, I'm not sure I could do that. I'm not sure I can do that. And I would guess if they actually understood what Jesus was saying, as Jesus is talking about being betrayed, some of his disciples wouldn't have been too sure about themselves. Maybe Peter probably was pretty sure, but maybe some of the others weren't so sure. Which is why Jesus encourages them. Look at verse 18. He says, "But not a hair of your head will perish." And verse 19, "By your endurance you will gain your lives," which is another statement that's kind of confusing because, like I just read about those people getting killed. So what is Jesus talking about here? Because we know he's not promising they're not going to get burned at the stake or eaten by wild animals, because he literally just told them some of them are going to die. So what's he saying? Not a hair of your head will perish. I think is actually another allusion, this time back to the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 3, where you remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are threatened, worship idols or be cast into a fiery furnace, and they refuse. And the king gets so angry, he orders the furnace to be heated 7 times more than it was usually heated, and his soldiers take them and throw them into the furnace, and the furnace is so hot that the soldiers die. But these 3 young men don't, and Nebuchadnezzar's shocked, and he gets up and he says to his advisors, "Didn't we throw 3 men in there?" And they say, "Yeah, that's true." And he says, "But I see 4 men walking in the midst of the fire, and they're not hurt." And he shouts to them to come out, and they come out of the fire, and everyone gathers together. And here's the verse, Daniel 3:27. "And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not any power over the bodies of these men. The hair of their head was not singed. Their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of the fire had come upon them." And so look, Jesus isn't promising that every single time we face persecution, we're not going to be physically harmed and that we're going to come out of the fire. But I think he's recalling this Old Testament story to remind the disciples as they look to the future and wonder how they're going to have the strength to stand, that he's going to be right there with them in the middle of it, going through the fire, right alongside of them. And he's going to protect what is most important. Verse 19, "By your endurance you will gain your lives." And what life is he talking about? Eternal life. Because I'm going to be with you and give you the supernatural strength you need to endure. You know what? You will. And you look at the disciples, and he did. Jesus kept his promise to them. And he will keep his promise to us, which is not that it's going to be easy until he comes back. He says the opposite. A lot of times, we take a stand for Jesus, we're going to be hated, gossiped about, slandered. We do the right thing, and people are not going to be excited. Like, whoa, you. They're going to be angry. And they're going to make plans somehow to hurt you or make you feel shame. So don't think persecution always means you're doing something wrong, and it's so surprising and just so unusual whenever people get upset. It's normal for followers of Jesus. But even if there is persecution, why would that stop you? Why would that stop you? If we really believe Jesus, we see here that he thinks about being persecuted differently than we do, and that he actually has good reasons for thinking that way. And we need to learn to think about being persecuted the way he does, because really, what do you have to be afraid of? God is going to use all that hate and anger to give you an opportunity to do what you were placed on the planet to do, to bear witness for Jesus. So the main thing you need to think about is it right, not is it easy. The main thing you need to think about is it right, not do I think it's going to work out. The main thing you need to think about is it right. It might not be right what you're thinking of doing. You might need to make a plan to do something differently. But the main thing you need to be thinking about is it right? Is this what Jesus wants me to do? Not can I figure out all the ins and outs of how this is going to be successful. Is it right? Is this what Jesus wants me to do? Do I really, and get help, you can ask for help, think about it, but is it right? And if it's right, then you need to say to self, and I need to say to myself, because I'm a guy who gets scared super easy. I need to say to myself, that fear that you're feeling, there's a sense in which it's normal. Nobody likes to go through pain, and God made us this way, but that fear becomes sinful. Normal fear becomes sinful if it causes me to doubt what Jesus says is true, if it causes me to do something that he tells me I shouldn't do, or if it keeps me from doing what he calls me to do. It might seem normal, but if it keeps me from doing what Jesus tells me to do, or causes me to not do, or to do something he tells me I shouldn't do, then it's sinful. It's sinful. No matter how justified it is, I need to say, no, man. No, I'm not going to I can't necessarily stop that feeling or some of the temptation, but I can say no to that fear. I'm not going to let it control me because I know, not just because I'm some strong, naturally courageous person, but because I believe, I believe Jesus, and he's with me, and he's going to give me abilities to obey. And if I really am a Christian, and if you really are a Christian, God's not just going to give you the ability to obey in that moment. He's going to give you the ability to endure and live, even if they kill you.